Hi, everybody. I'm live. I'm just not sure via what mechanism. I think I'm live in the correct way. Happy unusual grade school Friday time. Grade school Friday afternoon edition. How's everybody doing out there? What's going on with y'all? It's good to see my gang. Boy, is there a lot of fun stuff happening in my world. Gosh, where to begin? I guess right off the bat, I can't tell you guys how darn excited I am about the upcoming Colorist Career Accelerator course that's going to be happening June 16th through 19th. I am blown away at how fast you guys got in there, and to my 100 folks who joined in literally the less than, a little over 12 hours, I guess, that we had things open, including the early bird registration for my waitlist folks. To those of you who made it in for our registration cap, I'm so excited to hang out with y'all in a couple of weeks. It's going to be a blast. That's a huge part of where my head is at right now. I'm trying to get ready for that course and absolutely max out the value that we're going to have to offer for you guys. We're going to have so much fun stuff in store. I'm working on the final touches of the exclusive LUT bundle that's going to be a part of that course that I'm giving to participants. I'm working on the calibration workflow that I'm going to be demonstrating for you guys, and on all the cool offerings we're going to have for that. We're partnering with Portrait Displays, the makers of Calman, for the calibration portion. So you're going to come away equipped with some really good resources and know-how for doing your own calibrations. It's going to be awesome. So for those of you guys who made it in, I'm so glad. I can't wait to see y'all for it. For any of you guys who didn't make it this time around, don't worry. We're going to do it again really, really soon. I felt like this course was going to get a good response and that there was going to be a lot of interest in it. And I'm really happy to report that there has been, and you guys seem really engaged and excited by the idea. So this is not by any stretch the last time we're going to do it. We're going to do it at least once more this year. So stay tuned for that. And I believe in our show notes, we will have a waitlist link reactivated so that you can start to get on the wait list for the next round of the course and take advantage of all those cool things that I'm talking about doing right now that we're going to be doing again for the next round of the course. Gosh, what else? My buddy Gadali's here with me. What's going on, Gadali?
How's it going, Colin?
All is good. Oh, let me make sure that you are audible. I don't think I flipped that. Hang tight 1 second here.
Okay.
I think right now I'm the only one hearing you.
I'm your imaginary friend.
You're my imaginary friend, Gadali. That's exactly right. Say something else for me, buddy. Give me some more words there, Gadali. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Hang on. Gadali, try saying something else for me.
Now I can't hear you.
Okay, try. You should hear me now, and we should all
There
be
we
able to
go.
hear you if you give us some sweet
Hello there.
verbiage.
Sweet verbiage.
Sweet verbiage. Okay, I think that's working now.
Great.
So Gadali's here with me. He's going to be here to help me get everybody's questions organized and answered. We're talking today about something I have no real business talking about because I'm not a production person at all. I'm a post-production person. So why in the heck am I doing a grade school on the new ARRI camera, which does look very exciting, but why is Cullen stepping into that ring and saying, we're going to listen to what Cullen has to say about it? Well, I'll give you that disclaimer right up front. I am not anywhere near an expert on this new ARRI camera, or for that matter, any camera, because I'm just a post guy. I'm just your friendly neighborhood colorist. However, I want to talk about it today because I think there's a good opportunity here because the ARRI is brand new, because there's a lot that we know and a lot that we don't yet know about the way that the pipeline and the workflow is actually going to function for this new camera. I actually think this is a great opportunity to talk about how I engage with new and emerging technologies as a colorist, because as you guys know, I don't see myself in a passive role as a colorist. I feel like part of my responsibility in contributing max value to a production is I really do want to be able to function as an educator and an advisor on best practices. I want to be able to make informed advice and give informed guidance to my clients and collaborators and production counterparts. And I want to be as knowledgeable as I can about the way that new cameras and new pipelines and workflows affect what I'm doing so that I can give the best work and I can communicate best practices back to my production folks. And I think that that process really begins when the technology is announced, as opposed to like, another colorist could reasonably take the posture that like, well, there's a newer camera that it looks very exciting, and I'm sure that cinematographers and other production folks will learn sooner rather than later to leverage the new tools at their disposal with that camera system. And as they start to, and as specs get published and SDKs get implemented and Resolve or whatever your grading platform is starts to support that system, that's when I'll start to kind of adopt it and incorporate it into my workflow. And that'll sort of be how that adoption, journey looks for me as a post-production professional. That wouldn't be wrong to say. However, I want to be a little bit ahead of the curve if I can. I want to understand all the new things that are coming out, especially because it is ARRI. They've been a leader in this space for a long while, and especially because this isn't just a simple sensor upgrade. This is a sensor upgrade plus a change to pretty much everything else, near as I can tell, about the processing and the pipeline for this camera. So I may have just as many questions as I do answers at this point, but I thought we could talk today, and I will be honest with you guys and give you answers that I know and tell you when I don't know about different questions we may have about this workflow. And there are also questions that we can explore together. And I thought this would also be a good opportunity to look at the questions you guys have out there, which I guarantee you I have some of as well, and look at like, okay, as thoughtful post-professionals who want to be right up there with or a little bit ahead of the curve in terms of new emerging technologies, how can we find the right and the accurate answers to these questions so that even if we don't have all the information, we can best leverage the information that is out there for our own knowledge, and so that we can begin to meaningfully communicate with our production counterparts about how best to leverage this new technology. And if you guys haven't checked out the videos that ARRI's put out on the new Super 35 ARRI or the other content they've got out there, definitely go do it. It looks super cool and super exciting. And again, if I combine the marketing and the buzz that I'm seeing about this camera system with what I know about ARRI and with the amazing technologies and reputation that they already have within our business, I'm not gonna lie, I'm super excited. I'm a big ARRI fan, so I think all that stuff is reason to be excited about this new technology and to seek all the more so to really understand it as best we can in real time as information becomes available. So with all of that said, I'm not sure if I've given you guys a chance to build up any questions, but anything out there yet, Gadali, about this new camera system that we could talk about?
Not yet. I think everyone's just happy to be here.
Everyone's just thrilled to be here. Maybe everyone's mad to be here. They're like, all right, I joined for grade school, but now that I'm here, I'm mad that I'm here. So let's just talk in general about what we can say about this new system. And I've got some of ARRI's white papers kind of pulled up handy here. Funny enough, some of the best graphics and visual aids that they have created for this new color science are actually in the videos that they've done, but there's some decent ones here in these PDFs that I'm going to look at as well. So let's start by just talking about this overall pipeline and what I understand from it. Okay. So let's go end to end. As you guys know, like in an ideal scenario, as like cognizant motion image mastering professionals, we would understand everything in between light hitting a physical sensor and light coming off of some kind of display or, projector screen in some cases, right? That would be the ideal, is we'd have a really good top level understanding of every link in that chain between those two mile markers in the journey of an image, right? So let's look at the new ARRI camera from that point of view. Let's start with the sensor. There's a new sensor, isn't there? Sounds pretty cool. Sounds like it has been really optimized and really overhauled for a number of things, but the one that really stood out to me is what sounds like have been some changes to the effective gamut of this sensor, at least to the gamut that ends up getting encoded from the raw light that the sensor is exposed to. What I thought was really interesting is if we look at, I actually will share this image. So we've got ARRI Wide Gamut 4 now, right?
We're not seeing your screen color.
How about now? It should. I'm hoping it'll pop up minus the delayed reaction that you and I basically live in the future, Gadali. We live about 30 seconds in the future for the hour that it takes us to get through grade school. Let me know if this pops up. We should be seeing a PDF.
We're seeing it.
Cool. So, a couple things. First of all, just a really quick aside that I think is a great thing to emphasize at a moment like this. CIE horseshoe diagrams are too tempting not to use because they take a very complex 3D thing and they turn it into a relatively simple 2D thing, right? So if any of you guys are not familiar with this CIE horseshoe, this underlying shape underneath these triangles that we see here, this is meant to represent the gamut of human vision, right? Outside of these edges, there's still energy. You can still produce energy that hits at these wavelengths, but we don't see it, okay? So this horseshoe is meant to describe the visible gamut of colors for human vision, right? Again, oversimplified because that's a three-dimensional conversation, not a two-dimensional conversation, but that's what this horseshoe is meant to represent. And one of the things that I thought was really exciting and really supports some of the conclusions and ideas that I've been keen on for the last couple of years is they talk about having intentionally designed the new ARRI Wide Gamut 4 to be indeed a wide gamut. As you can see, it's a bit bigger than REC 2020, which is the largest display gamut that we currently have a standard for, but not designing it so large that you end up with what they call in the literature here, what's the terminology that they use? They use, I think, fictional colors. I forget there's a term they use here that I actually think is really good. In the past, I've heard them referred to as imaginary colors. But if we look at the wide gamut here, let's see, virtual colors is what they call them there. So all that means is that, like you can see, there are some virtual colors in this triangle. If you look at the ACES AP0 spec, there are even more. Virtual colors are colors that we can't actually see, that don't have any meaning to a human visual system, right? So what I think is really cool about applying this sort of like constraint to the construction or the like concept behind a gamut is that you're going to end up with colors that don't seem hyper real or unreal, if that makes sense. And that's something that I've talked about a little bit here on the channel and certainly have experienced a lot in my color grading practice where it's like, okay, this is great that I have this great big wide gamut, whatever it may be, the DaVinci Wide Gamut or ACES AP0 or some other such big scene gamut. But one of the challenges that you encounter in there is there's all kinds of territory. There are all kinds of points within that three-dimensional space that actually represent colors that don't really occur in our natural vision. They either don't occur very often or in some cases never occur. And we have to figure out, well, what does that mean? Even though we're going to color manage and we're going to transform out to another system, what do we actually need to do with those colors to get them into a reasonable pocket? So I think I'm really encouraged to hear them talking about the avoidance of virtual colors and having a sensibly large, but also a sensibly bounded gamut so that you end up with a more naturalistic color palette that's more confined to colors that you are likely to or are going to encounter out there in the real world, as opposed to colors that are like, wow, there's a whole other category of colors that we can have in image reproduction that we can see. It's just that they don't actually have a real world corollary. They're colors that instead of appearing to reflect light and like surface colors that appear to reflect light in a way that agrees with our vision, they actually appear to fluoresce or to be emissive, even though it's the color of what should be a reflective object, if that makes sense. So that's the first piece there. That was all kind of a tangent, just talking about something that seems to be built into the actual like acquisition point of the sensor. Let me go back to where I was within that graph. You guys will have to forgive me. I'm not super well versed in this PDF yet, but I was looking, here we go. So we're looking back here at the sensor. And then it appears we've got a new and improved debayering algorithm, which sounds really promising, especially for dealing with edges. And for any of you guys who don't know, any raw format is going to do what's called bayering the image because there are red, green, and blue photo sites on that sensor. And the image that each of those, or the data that each of those photo sites captures, gets mosaicked into an encoded or a Bayered state, which we can't look at in its native form because it's just a bunch of individual, like I saw red here and green there and blue there and then green there and then red there and then blue there. It's just a mosaic of individual discrete channel samples that then have to be combined into red, green, and blue values. And so the way that we debayer or unpack or process that image for actual viewing, that's actually a big link in the chain that unless you are a hardcore geek, and I mean way more hardcore than I am, you're not going to be going in and writing your own debayering algorithm. And in most cases, you don't even have that opportunity. ARRI is one of the few formats that gives you a little bit of flexibility there if you want to be insane and do that. All that to say, the way we debayer matters, and since we don't have control over it, I'll take every advantage or improvement that I can get because that's got a huge impact on the image. So we've got a new debayering algorithm here. Here within this graph, as I'm looking at it, we've got the ARRI color engine, which to be honest with you, I don't exactly remember what all that entails. Someone can jog my memory if you guys know in the chat. But what we're going to end up with here is ARRI Wide Gamut 4 Log C4 as the sort of like fruits of our image. That's what we're going to end up grading when we are actually operating on it as post-production professionals. And just to sort of round out the beginnings of the conversation, it sounds like one of the other key updates is, unlike the ARRI Look File 2 format, which is what's currently used in ARRI cameras, the ARRI Look File 4 format uses something that I've been advocating for a long time, which is scene-referred looks, such as my Kodak 2383 look. That's available in the description for the show here today if you want to grab that and you haven't already. Or for that matter, my Core Elements LUTs, which are also going to be linked here in the show description. Those are scene looks. Those are what ARRI is calling log-to-log looks, meaning that they remain in whatever color space they began in, and the technical transformation from scene space out to display space is happening downstream or after that creative application of the look in a discrete separate process, if that makes sense. So I think that's a huge upgrade. Again, in ALF2, that was all combined into one thing. Your ARRI look file was going to have a look plus a technical transform all baked in there. And you guys have heard me advocate a ton for the fact that yes, there's interaction between our technical transform and our creative look. However, those should really, in a best practice, be modularized, to make up a word, so that you can use them in discrete elements as opposed to just all being stacked together. So that's another thing that stuck out to me early on about this system. Now, a question that I have that there's been some conversation about that so far I haven't heard a definitive conclusion about. I might have some better answers for us if I get the chance to go and speak with ARRI and check out the camera at Cinegear here in Los Angeles next week. But one question that I have is, am I now tethered to applying my technical transform using the ARRI technical transform, which they've published? And by the way, it's sort of hiding out low key, but you can see this link here in this PDF. They actually already have released 3D LUTs for getting from the new ARRI Log 4, ARRI Wide Gamut 4 space out to PQ 1000 nit or out to REC709 100 nit, whatever you're trying to do. Those LUTs have actually been released, even though they haven't seemed to release the encoding and decoding curves for the Log C4 curve or the primaries for the ARRI Wide Gamut new color gamut either. The actual LUTs are there anyway, so that's a start and something you can begin to explore. But that's a question that I know is being asked around a bit, and I haven't heard a definitive answer yet, is since my ALF4, my ARRI look file, is now just a scene look, which is great, good news. Since that's the case, do I still have control over the way that my log C4 image gets rendered out on a technical basis to the display, or am I stuck with ARRI's technical transform out to the display, which, while I trust will be quite good, I know that many camera operators would like to have more control over that. And I know that I certainly, as a post-production professional, would like to be able to hand my counterparts a full-on show LUT, including the transformation out to the display, so that there actually is that combination in that context of the creative and the technical transformation all built into one. Because as I said, it's all good and well in the ultimate grading pipeline to see those things as separate modules and to have them exist that way. But the truth is that they interact with each other in all kinds of ways. So it's not enough for me to say, here's the look, and however you render it to your display doesn't matter. It does matter. And in an ideal pipeline, creative professionals would be able to completely control that, even if their intent doesn't completely agree with the stock transform provided by ARRI. So that's a question that I have. I'm optimistic that if it's not an immediately available feature, that it will be in subsequent releases, because I know that there are a lot of production folks who will advocate very vocally for that. But that's one of the many questions that I still have about the system that maybe I'll get some better answers on next week. And a caveat that I should have thrown out at the beginning of this conversation for all of us is, if you're watching this in 6 months or in a year and it's aged really poorly, I'm sorry. I'm doing my best. I'm trying to give you the best information available at the time, but it may all prove to completely change or be completely wrong. And if so, then we'll have to do a new grade school on the new and updated information and technology about the new ARRI Alexa Super 35. That's some stuff. Gadali, anything out there?
Yeah, we've got a question from Andre about how is the dynamic range improvement going to affect the post workflow?
You know, that's a great question. And I've had some really interesting conversations lately that have had me kind of re-inventorying my own mindset about dynamic range. Here would be my answer for you. Now, full disclosure, this is like 100% subjective, creative take that not everyone is going to agree with me about, and probably not everyone should. But I'll put it to you this way. There seems to be a bit of a confusion since the arrival of HDR, where like with SDR, we've just always taken it for granted that as you climb up your tone scale, like let me just put a visual to go with this. Actually, let's have some fun. Let's look at the brand new ARRI LUTs. Let's look at their the Log C4 to REC709 LUT. Okay. Let's look at the tone scale on this thing. We've kind of always understood. Now, before we even get into that, we can observe, like, as they mentioned in the literature here, mid-gray has moved way the heck down in this new Log C4 format. So mid-gray is living around, what is it, 0.28 or so now? Now I just want to make sure I'm getting my facts right. Yeah, it's living at 28%, so which is much lower than the 39% of Log C3. So before we continue this conversation about looking at tone scale and linear response, let's just look at like the prior generation, the like Log C transform here. And just look at the pivot point between these two. Huge difference, right? So that gives you a sense right there. One broad conclusion that we can arrive at very quickly is like, okay, so this is not like, I don't know, S-log2 versus S-log3, or like, like a small nudge, or like log CV2 versus log CV3. This is a huge change in this encoding curve. And if you treat log CV4 like V3 or vice versa, you're going to get really, really problematic results, because we can see, even without yet knowing the exact encoding function for log C4, we can see just by that movement of that mid-gray point and by the comparison that they make here in this literature between the two curves, the graphic that they do here, these are very, very different curves. So that's a top-level conclusion we can make right away that I think is useful for us to make as post-professionals. We got to make sure we're buttoned up. The first time you get a piece of Alexa Super 35 footage into your system, you better make darn sure you've got the right tools to support that imaging pipeline, because log CV3 is not going to cut it, right? Okay, back to what I was talking about here. We've just had it as a top-level conclusion when we're talking about SDR. We've known for a long while that as you climb your tone scale, you are going to get less and less of a linear response in your highlights, right? And so as HDR comes along, I think the fundamental question that has come along with it is, well, is that compression, increasing compression in our highlights, is that something we've just always done because we had to? Or is there actually something artful or pleasing about that type of rendering, right? That's a kind of big question to ask. And I don't think I'm going to be the one to, I don't think any one person gets to decide the answer. But to go back to the question that's being asked, I think the question becomes, well, when we're talking about HDR, where we do have the ability to reproduce more of the dynamic range as was captured by the camera, how much of that dynamic range do we wish to reproduce? Or to put it even more broadly, how linear of a response do we wish to have up to the limitation of the display? Because with an HDR display, we can actually get a far more linear response, and we can continue to see discrete separations between kind of bright, brighter, much brighter, even brighter than that, and way the hell brighter than that, like tonal variations. With an HDR monitor, with like a full-on 1000 nit reference monitor, you can park those things in discrete positions and see all of them, right? The question becomes, do you want to? Is that something that you find creatively advantageous? And really, if you think about the spectrum, it's like, okay, on one end, you guys have heard me use this terminology before. You've got like creamy or rolly highlights on the far left, which is like what we see here in this SDR rendering, where by the time the curve is actually connecting in with the top, it's almost horizontal. And then on the other end, you've got really pingy or sharp or linear highlights where you would see this same curve just take off in a straight line and have very little rollover as it approaches the top of the container. So those are the two kind of goalposts, the ends of the spectrum. And I think the creative question that everyone's going to answer a bit differently is, well, where do you want to plot along that? How linear versus how creamy do you want your highlight response to be? And so I think the question, how much of this new dynamic range in the camera is going to actually change the rendering as it passes through the color grade and the render? That sort of depends on what your creative intent is, right? If I'm doing a grade sort of in agreement with what I tend to like best, and I'm working with clients who share a similar aesthetic, probably not much. I may find that I have more ability to sculpt and shape and pull things in from up there, or to hold really hot highlights and roll them over in a more pleasing way. But put it to you this way, very simply, if there's an extra stop and a half of latitude up there, that absolutely does not mean that I will seek to or wish to see an extra stop and a half in my HDR image. I plot closer toward that creamy end of the creamy to pingy spectrum, if that makes sense. My personal aesthetic is to lean more toward that creamy. So there's always going to be a lot of roll and a lot of compression. And I don't want to see a linear response in the upper end of my image simply because I can. However, if I did want to see that, then maybe my answer to this question would be a bit different. And I would say that's actually great because it allows me to better preserve and to sort of reproduce more discrete tonal variations in that very upper end of the tone scale.
Getting a lot of questions around whether Log C4 will be available as a color space transform. I think also there's the issue that in ARRI's presentation, they said you must use our LUTs. So just a question about, will color space transforms be possible?
Yeah, so this is another area where I can't claim expertise, but I'll put it to you, I'll put money on this. ARRI has always been really, really good about publishing and being open about the way that their technology works so that you can freely see what it is and you can manipulate it if you want to. And even if you look at like this textures thing, which we need to talk about in a moment, that's cool. And that's all about taking a bunch of assumptions that were just a built-in set of adjustments that we had no knowledge of, much less control over, and giving that control over to the user. So I will say this, I trust ARRI to continue to be a filmmaker friendly company and to want to put more and more meaningful control in the hands of the filmmaker. So I don't have any doubt in my mind that the Log C4 Arri Wide Gamut spec will be made freely available. And in fact, they already allude to that in their literature. And it certainly will be implemented in color space transforms. It'll be supported in color management frameworks like ACES. It'll be in there. And while I've heard that claim sort of bouncing around that, oh, you have to use ARRI's color science, I haven't actually seen that or registered that in any of their literature or content that I've seen come out. Now, I may totally have missed it, but I think whether or not I missed it, that's another good opportunity for us to emphasize something. when we as colorists are seeking to educate ourselves about new and emerging technologies, it's really, really important that we get the facts right. So it's okay to not know all the answers yet. And I'm not saying to you right now that it's impossible that ARRI would say, you must render through our viewing transforms. That's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's certainly possible. But that's a very different thing than to say, well, I heard someone say it who sounded authoritative, or it was said in a venue which generally has knowledgeable people in it, so I now accept that as fact. It's not that you're calling anyone a liar. It's that as a post-professional and as a thoughtful post-professional, we need to admit when we don't know something and only draw conclusions that are based on statements and things that have been published from the actual company that's making that publication. So I would bet, I'd bet somebody a cup of fancy coffee that this, like manacled workflow of having to use ARRI's display transform, either in camera on set or in the ultimate pipeline, I don't believe that that's going to be the case. I just have too much faith in ARRI and their reputation to think that that's really going to be a thing. It may be that it starts off that way and they have to patch it with some firmware updates so that they need to address that. But no, I don't believe that's a thing. And I will emphasize again, I have thus far not been able to find any claim in their content or literature that explicitly states that. I've heard other people draw that conclusion, but I haven't actually heard it explicitly stated as such in any of the content that I've seen thus far.
And also multiple people are asking, how does ARRI Wide Gamut 4 compare with DaVinci Wide Gamut?
So I think if we look at our graph here, actually, let's see here. I'm not feeling bold enough to go digging through my files live with you guys because God knows what we're going to stumble past along the way. But I can just quote to you from memory. Or actually, I'll tell you, let's go this way. You'll just have to look at my dumb face for a minute while I look through my files, and that way you don't have to look at my whatever unsightly things I'm going to encounter along the way. But we can actually get a reasonable answer to that question by Googling it. All right, so what do you guys think? Is this kind of crazy to be like looking at like PDFs and web browsers with me? This feels kind of odd. Okay, so here's the DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Now, I just got done dogging on the 2D XY chromaticity diagram as the end-all be-all, but we can at least get a look at, okay, so in this graph, DaVinci Wide Gamut is represented by the thick bold line way out here. So we just got done talking about so-called virtual colors. There's a lot of virtual colors in there. So the idea, I like the idea that ARRI is introducing into the conversation of tempering this idea of a future-proof, massive color gamut with the idea of a color gamut which doesn't contain a bunch of problematic virtual colors. So you can even look in this graph and see, oh, here's the old ARRI Wide Gamut, which is actually bigger, it would seem, than the new ARRI Wide Gamut because it sticks far further outside of the CIE horseshoe than in this other graphic. And DaVinci Wide Gamut is way the heck bigger than that. So we can observe that the gamut is significantly larger. And we can see that here. Like, look how much more tamed in the ARRI Wide Gamut 4 is, which I think is so cool. I love that we're not in a, everything is like an arms race, I feel like, with filmmaking now. We need more Ks, more resolution, more dynamic range, more color volume. I love that they're running against the tide here and saying, no, well, like, what's a color volume that actually works and supports the creative agendas of filmmakers? So I love that we're kind of running counter to that trend here in this, at least graphic here. And then in terms of dynamic range, we can read the specs and the sort of marketing claims of like, oh, X stops of dynamic range in this new system. But the real test will be when we have an explicit encoding and decoding function for log CV4, at which point we can actually compare the fruits of that encoding and decoding function versus the encoding and decoding function of DaVinci Intermediate in terms of understanding that dynamic range.
Douglas is asking, how can we steal ARRI's new color science and apply it to grading other cameras?
Well, I suppose it depends on what link in the chain of the color science we are after. I'm really curious to see, based on this new sensor and based on this ARRI Wide Gamut 4 being the only container that its fruits are, like ever sort of handed to us in, I think that's a really critical part of the color science chain right there, if I'm understanding and believing what I'm being told by ARRI, because there's a lot that's happening. Based on what I'm seeing in the marketing, it doesn't sound like if I expose, this to ARRI Wide Gamut, it doesn't sound like the response of the sensor is going to be to give me a nasty clipped value that just slams into the wall of the closest edge that the ARRI Wide Gamut is capable of capturing. What I'm understanding is that there appears to be some nonlinearities happening at the capture stage to pleasingly compress and wrap the overall gamut of colors that might be encountered in the real world to inhabit this gamut, if that makes sense. If that assumption is the case, and that is an assumption, it's a pretty well-founded assumption, but it is an assumption. If that assumption is the case, boy, that's a big piece of the puzzle right there. And how do we take advantage of that? I suppose that depends on how generous ARRI are with publishing the science behind it and how dedicated we are to going, oh, let's take that idea of, essentially, we're talking about gamut mapping. Let's take that idea and apply it to, like data that we might take from some other camera and, to move back into a pure like scene linear state, like XYZ linear or something, and then look at taking values outside of a prescribed gamut, say ARRI Wide Gamut 4, and instead of just doing an XYZ to ARRI Wide Gamut 3x3 matrix, actually looking at, in addition to that, doing that same flavor of gamut mapping that ARRI is doing to compress those hues in that same fashion. Again, I'm expressing excitement over a gamut mapping algorithm that I'm not sure exists and I haven't seen, but I think that if that's a thing, that would be a key part of the new ARRI color science and something I'd be very keen to learn all I could about and undertake such an experiment as I'm describing potentially. And then the other piece of it, honestly, is like the goalposts or the ends are going to be the most significant. So that's significant. The rest in between, near as I understand it, I'll caveat this because this is a good spot to talk about these textures that they're releasing. These textures, as I understand them, are a control over the way that texture is rendered in the captured image. And this is actually baked into the capture, even if it's ARRI raw. So I can see the potential for lots of harm, but also a lot of creative potential. And the quick previews that I looked in the demonstration content that ARRI put out, I threw up on my 65-inch LG, and it's really cool to see these different textures and the way that they're rendered. And that's color science that I would also be very keen to get some kind of, like untethered access to, so that it's not tethered to the camera. However, my understanding would be that since they are telling us that's baked right into the capture, I doubt that that's because I think that's probably because it has to be. I think that's probably because the science that they are applying is actually happening very early in the processing stream. So that may not be color science that can be translated or ported to any other link in the chain. So for example, if I have a captured negative from some other camera, the science that ARRI is using to manipulate these textures and render them may not be applicable or function soundly or in the same way by the time you have an RGB debayered image, if that makes sense. But this is certainly another new piece of color science that I find very exciting and to be a new sort of creative frontier for filmmakers. But setting aside the textures piece, the last thing that I was going to speak to regarding Douglas's question is if we say, okay, well, we look at the way that the image is actually encoded into its negative form. We look at this textures thing, and you could sort of expand that out to talk about like the MTF curve in general, and there might be ways to model that MTF curve for other cameras, again, within the limitations of the point in the pipeline at which you're accessing that other camera material. But then you can also just look at the far end of it. I just got done saying I don't want there to be only one choice for my display transform. I don't want to just have to use ARRI's. However, ARRI's display transforms have historically looked quite good, and if I can assume that all the images that I'm looking at the demo content of were rendered through ARRI's display transform, those seem to be compelling display transforms. So that's another piece of image science, of their image science, which we could potentially port for our own uses. If we have, for example, a ARRI Log C4 to Gamma 2.4 REC709 rendering. So this is ARRI's answer to the soundest or most pleasing way to get from Log C4 ARRI Wide Gamut out to REC709 Gamma 2.4. Well, we could take this same concept and just tee up our content from camera X and do a camera X to ARRI Log C4 Wide Gamut transform upstream of this, and then apply this LUT on top of that. And we're now rendering out to our display using ARRI's solution for how to get from scene to display. Because this transform is really not much about Log C4 or ARRI Wide Gamut. It's been teed up to expect those things. But this transform is really more about the subjective decisions that were made in the creation of this transform. How much contrast should there be? How should we map edge cases for gamut? So if we like what this does, then this is certainly something else that we could look at borrowing and applying even if we didn't originally shoot on an Alexa 35. So just a couple of thoughts there about some of the different color science that might be worth trying to borrow for use in other non-ARRI applications and how we might go about doing that.
This is a question from me, I guess. One wanted to know if you could go over the different philosophy between different camera manufacturers and resolution and their color science. For example, Red with larger resolutions tends to favor capturing at a higher resolution so that there are more pixels at the delivery resolution for color information, whereas ARRI is more on the side of a better debayer algorithm or something like that. Can you talk about the differences between those approaches for rendering colors?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can preface this with the same preface I've given to most of what we're talking about today, which is that I cannot claim expertise on that matter. But, you know, like I'll put it to you guys this way. The interval in our imaging pipeline between light hitting the individual red, green, and blue photosites of a CMOS sensor and here's your negative, whether that's a QuickTime movie or an ARRI RAW or a Red RAW or some other, like B-RAW format, some other RAW format, that interval is actually really, really critical. And we don't get much insight into that interval for two reasons. A, it's complicated and it's not that easy to understand. And B, understandably, camera manufacturers are somewhat protective of the proprietary methods that they are using to make that work, because that's actually not easy to do. We take it for granted. We're like, oh yeah, red, green, and blue photosites, bayer them and then debayer them, and then you end up with a reasonable reproduction of the image as it was seen by the sensor. That all sounds quite cut and dry, but it's not. So in terms of like, how many photosites do you crowd onto a sensor and how large do you make that sensor, and what should that relationship be to the final display output? That's complex stuff. And even if you go back to the film days, which I would argue were, they sort of demanded a bit more technical knowledge from the average cinematographer or production team or camera department, like the sort of like top level summary that you would look at, one of the key metrics that you'll find in any data sheet for a film stock is what they call the MTF, the modulation transfer function, which I mentioned a couple minutes ago. That's going to be hugely affected by the things we're talking about. How many photosites, how big the sensor, what's the final output resolution, and what type of scaling is being done along the way to fit the acquisition resolution down to the output resolution. And to be honest with you, I think it would be really fun and something I've been meaning to do for a while to actually tee up a really thorough set of A/B tests of like, all right, what if I shoot this camera at this resolution and try scaling to this resolution using this method? Okay, what if I do the same thing but scale it using another method? What if I scale to a smaller size using those same kind of comparison of several different methods. What if I now expose the same scene with the same lens and the same lighting conditions and match my exposure between camera A and B, and then I run all those same tests and just control for and analyze those variables? And I know more has been done with that than I'm aware of, certainly. I know there are people running those tests. I would be really keen to lay eyes on them and sort of like arrive at a creative conclusion or evaluation of like, what are those differences and how do they best work? But to be honest with you, that's kind of the extent of my expertise in that area. It matters a lot. And if you were to run those tests, they would not be boring. You'd go, wow, that's interesting. Look how this compares to that. But what exactly you would see, I don't actually know. And if I get the chance to run those tests, I will share their fruits with all of you guys and we'll get to talk about it more.
All right. Question, switching gears to DaVinci Wide Gamut. Someone has the working space, color space of DaVinci Wide Gamut, and after a technical transform, they say their middle gray changes. They want to preserve middle gray before creative contrast. Can I use linear gain to match the 344 unity line?
Oh, man. Someone knows that middle gray is my favorite topic to discuss. Let's break it. Let's chop it up. Let's talk about it. All right, so let's do a DaVinci Wide Gamut pipeline here. I'm going to map my log CV3, which feels so yesterday's news now after all this log CV4 talk, but we'll have to content ourselves with it for now. So I've got a very simple color management pipeline, which I happen to be doing in nodes. You might do in your project settings. And if you did, you'd be invoking the same algorithms and mechanisms that I'm invoking here. I'm just doing it in nodes because that's my personal preference. So I'm going from ARRI Alexa Log C into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And then I'm grading in between. And I'm then going out from DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate to REC709 Gamma 2.4. Okay. So here's the question. If I'm understanding the question correctly, let's take advantage of my exposure chart here. Also going to be linked in our show notes for today. And let's move into DaVinci Intermediate and go down to one single step and turn our ramp off. So I'm just looking at a patch of middle gray in DaVinci Intermediate. Pretty boring, right? I'll pull up my waveform. Gadali, can you confirm for me? Can you see my waveform?
I cannot right now. But maybe the
oh yeah, the lag
feature. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you should be able to, but I've been having issues. Yeah, you seeing it?
Yep.
Okay, good deal. So if we take a look at this and we turn off our output transform, and we don't actually need to do this right now because I'm feeding what I know to be an accurate value. But let me just flip to my face for a second here, and I'm going to pull up another goodie that you guys have heard me talk about a lot, my mid-grade cheat sheet, also available as a download in the show notes for today. So let's look at this mid-grade cheat sheet. I'm going to flip my GUI back on. So here's my mid-grade cheat sheet, and I can see that DaVinci Intermediate in a 10-bit scale, which is what I'm in my scopes right now, should be resting at a 344. So let's go over here to my waveform, turn on my reference levels, and type in 344 for my low value. And if I turn that reference level off and on, this is exactly what I want to see, which is nothing. I can't see the line. The line is just getting a little fatter, right? So that means that, as you would expect, my synthetic gray card that I'm generating with my exposure chart in the proper tone curve is perfectly nailing the mid-gray of DaVinci Intermediate. Now, what do we use this for? You guys have seen me talk about my main use for this in the past. I will turn this on, get this pure gray patch in my working space generated, and then when I go to do my creative contrast curve for my overall look, which is usually my first stop for an overall look, the first thing I will do for that first step is pin this anchor point here to my mid-gray. And this means that no matter what other kind of fun I get into above and below that point, my contrast curve that I'm drawing is anchored around middle gray. This is at the look development stage, okay? I always want to be clear here to say that I'm not telling you you cannot move middle gray creatively. You absolutely can, and you often should. You often want to. What I am telling you is that at the look stage, at the macro level creative transform stage, you don't want to move middle gray unless you're doing so explicitly, right? Because what you're going to find if you do that inadvertently is, okay, you're going to go, okay, I've got my look built out. It looks great. I'm going to turn my display transform back on. Everything's looking great. Let's start grading. And if you have inadvertently moved your mid-gray down a third of a stop, what that's going to mean on average is that for every single shot, you will end up having to slightly up compensate your exposure. It's just more adjustments, more counter compensations that you're going to have to make because you weren't mindful to preserve your mid-gray at that macro level. That's where it's important to preserve mid-gray. Shot level, you should put mid-gray wherever the hell you want. You shouldn't even be looking at the meter readings at that point, in my opinion. You should just be grading by eye and going like, this feels great to me. I don't give a damn where middle gray is sitting. I just like the way the image looks, right? It's pipeline where we want to be concerned. But the question that was being asked was about middle gray through a output transform. Let's look at what happens here. I have so far mapped an image into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, applied a mid-gray preserving creative contrast curve, and I'm now passing out through my exact REC709 Gamma 2.4 color space transform that I tend to use when I'm grading. Let's turn my mid-gray card back on. Let's look at the waveform as I flip this off and on. It moves, doesn't it? Important lesson here. Middle gray has no explicit definition in display space. This is actually a very much debated thing among colorists and filmmakers because there's actually, if I remember to do it, there's a great post from one of my heroes, Mr. Josh Pines, color scientist of legend, who made a great post on Aces Central one day saying that there's huge disagreement about what HDR means for middle gray. Some of us think it means middle gray should move up. Others think that it means everything above middle gray should move up. And there's not a consensus out there among that. So where middle gray rests is very much a point of discussion and not at all something that is to be taken for granted. I tend to like middle gray to sit exactly where you see it right now, which is right around 410 or so. And because I like that, I actually move my adaptation here in this color space transform off of its stock value of 9. I move it up to 16, so my middle gray is just a hair more open than the stock transform will give me. That's purely preferential. There's a point where it's like, all right, it's probably not really valid to put middle gray at like a 150, nor is it valid to put it at like 500 because you're going to burn someone's retinas. But there's lots of room in between where it just comes down to your creative taste. But my point with all this is you don't necessarily need to be looking to pin middle gray to where it belonged when you were looking at it in scene space. So while I've been mindful all the way throughout my process up until now to make sure that mid-gray is staying, in this case, at 344, you do not need to be mindful of that for display space. If anything, you should be reading up on ARRI, among others, have some really great guidelines to offer about like, here's where we think mid-gray is optimally placed. You can read up on those things and draw your own conclusions, but they're almost certainly not going to be perfectly aligned with the actual original scene middle gray because displays have all other kinds of factors that come into consideration when we're thinking about where should the middle exposure of our image rest in an actual display rendering. So I hope that's helpful there.
Okay, question here about display transforms. You frequently set an input of, let's see, I'm not sure I quite understand this one. Set an input, say, of log C of 10,000 nits. Are nits not only relevant to what a display can emit? Can you plot 10,000 nits on a log curve? In other words, I understand why you would specify a nit value on the output of a display transform. Would it not make sense to have an input specify IRE values of 0 to 1023?
Great question. Yeah. So here's some ideas that we can add to that conversation. First of all, nits and their explicit tethering to code value, that's actually something that is a part of the PQ curve spec. So when I tell you like the most common application for like an absolute luminance is when we're talking about the PQ curve, which, I mean, by the way, this is a good thing to note in general. Like when I say nits here, this is technically none of this is correct, because this 100 nits is only meaningful if that's what I've measured the actual output of my display at this code value to reproduce, right? So if I calibrate and I calibrate to 100 nits, that's meaningful. Whether or not that's the average light output of a signal with this strength that I send to it, to a particular TV or to the average TV, that's very much debatable. So even just in that simple context on the output side, pinning math to a measurable light level is not as simple as it sounds. But in terms of anchoring nit value to like scene space or log values, yeah, absolutely. The PQ curve is all about that. The PQ curve is a log curve. So if I tell you I want to do P3 D65 1000 nit PQ, like a common HDR standard, that is expressed in a log curve, just like log C. I mean, not just like log C, but it's a log curve like log C is. So you absolutely can designate those things in that way. It is completely meaningful and reasonable. And in fact, you can look at ARRI log C, and actually probably the more accurate thing to do that I try to remember to do that I don't always, is to set a max input that actually reflects the max that my log C curve can encode. Log C curve actually can't encode more than 5,500 nits, because the effective range of log C scene linear values is 1 to 55. So that's actually the highest I can go. I can tell it to reach higher for more values. It's just not going to find anything up there. So yes, it is meaningful on both sides, but only to the extent that we are correlating nit values, which are about measured luminance of an actual display, with code values, which I think, to go back to the original question, is well asked, because there is actually like correlating those things in a tidy one-to-one way is not that easy, although it's actually easier to do when we are talking about scene spaces in some ways than when we are talking about display spaces, where we actually are sending it out to a display and the display has to actually agree with the signal. Whereas with scene spaces, nits could just as easily be an arbitrary linear value or log value, because we're not correlating it with an actual display. It's just, what code value would you like to map in what way, if that makes sense. So I hope that answers the question, or at least asks 5 new interesting ones. And oh my goodness, you guys, we did a good roundup here. Let's do a couple more here, Gadali, if we have them.
Okay. Question from Alec here. Is there ever an instance for web delivery where your output color space and gamma would be anything other than REC709 Gamma 2.4, such as using a combination of P3 DCI and REC709-A or anything else?
No, not typically. I mean, the only caveat I would throw out there is like for deliverables for streaming services, which ultimately could be, like you could watch a Netflix series on your laptop, of course, and the deliverable for that is probably, if I'm doing a Dolby Vision master, which is P3 D65, there's then a Dolby Vision sidecar that has the mapping information to get down to REC709. But no, I'm thinking out loud. No, it's like I can't see any circumstance where that would come about. For me, it's always going to be 709, and then the gamma part, that's a bit fuzzier because, like, as you guys have heard me talk about, I'll do this all the time. If I know that it's going to YouTube or Vimeo, for example, I'll do this. Like, does that mean, I guess I could argue to you that because this is based off of compensating in a scientific way for what I've seen Frame.io and Vimeo do time and time again, that this is actually preserving my Gamma 2.4, you could argue. But you could also say, well, that's actually not Gamma 2.4 because that's no longer the function that you're using to encode your display rendering, in which case it's like, some messy compound gamma function that Cullen came up with to counter for the measured behavior of particular platforms. So in that sense, the gamma thing is a bit more of a moving target. And you guys have also heard me talk about, like, it would not be insane to me to target gamma 2.2 for a web deliverable, for example. But the REC709 piece, those are always going to be the primaries, and the gamma is always going to be somewhere in that, between 2.2 and 2.4 neighborhood, and perhaps with some, like slightly fancier stuff happening in the very bottom or the very near bottom of the toe, just to make some visual compensations. That's the long answer. Short answer, no. It's going to be some kind of REC709 Gamma encoding in any circumstance I can think of. We can do one more if we have one handy.
Let's see. Question that was interesting of a feature from Alex. Why does the default contrast pivot not switch to the middle gray of the working color space?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, if you want to know the answer to that, you need to know a little bit about the history of the DaVinci color corrector. So the reason is that, you could ask that question in a slightly different way, or you could ask a related question of why 0.435? What middle gray does that represent? What centered anchor point or average best anchor point does that represent? Why 0.435? Well, probably the easiest way to answer that is to understand that DaVinci started as color correctors and as telecine tools, and the contrast pivot knob, the first time someone decided, hey, we need a contrast pivot knob. I do not know this for sure, so don't quote me. I could be wrong, but I am quite confident that the first time this contrast pivot knob was designed, it was designed for REC709 images, which, as we were talking about a couple minutes ago, might indeed have a middle gray awfully damn near 0.435. I just got done telling you guys that I like to park my middle gray somewhere right around a 0.4 or so. So that's my best conclusion, that 0.435 has more to do with the mid gray of a gamma encoded display signal than with any scene space. So it's almost a double whammy of why doesn't it map with different tone curves, and what tone curve is it meant to center itself within in the first place? It's not it's perfect for log C, but the moment you go anywhere else, it doesn't work. It's just not really correct for any log tone curve that I can think of off the top of my head. Let's look at our mid-gray cheat sheet, and we could conclude okay, so for Fuji F log, actually, that's interesting. For Cineon, it's right around there. So maybe that's our answer. Maybe it's a P log lin thing. In this flavor of Cineon encoding, which coincidentally was devised by Josh Pines, who I mentioned a little while ago, this is where his P log lin formula for encoding, for film density encoding, nets out mid-gray. That doesn't seem like a coincidence, does it? Maybe that's what it is. I actually hadn't thought about that until just now, but maybe that could indeed be the answer right there, that it's about a metric for film scans. That seems to be as reasonable as any. But why isn't it color space aware? I'm not so sure. And I actually would argue that for me personally, I would rather, in my fixed node graph, if I have a contrast node, which I generally do, you guys know my tree pretty well now at this point. If we have exposure, we have ratio, and if we have balance, I would rather do what I actually do, which is in my ratio node, I have my pivot preset to the mid-gray of whatever I'm working in. In the case of ARRI log C, that would be 0.391. So why isn't it color space aware? Good question. Why is it at the value that it's at in the first place? Also a good question. Hopefully that's some insight in both cases as to why those things may be. And also a very good solution that to me is almost preferable to adding the bloat of a color space aware knob that used to be agnostic. Just simply, when you're defining your template node graph, set your pivot manually to where it belongs, and then every time you land on that node, having applied it from a template, you'll have a pivot that's positioned in the proper place for anchored contrast adjustments. You guys are awesome. That was an action-packed conversation. I feel like we got to cover a lot of ground and probably not definitively answer every question that we all have about the new ARRI camera or the other things that we were discussing, but I think we had some meaningful conversation and some good guesses. And as I said, if you're watching this in 6 months or a year and I prove to be dead wrong, sorry about that. I'll have to do new content to update my thinking. But as I said, I think this is a meaningful time to talk about these things so that we can really think about becoming as much of an authority or an expert as good information will allow us to. And then we don't want to fake it. We don't want to act like we know more than we do with our clients. But this way, just from having spent the last couple days that I have talking and thinking about these things and continued to explore, I feel like the next client that calls me up that wants to do an ARRI Alexa 35 project, or they just want to know more about it, I can give them my informed, honest opinion. And I can also tell them, hey, I don't know. And it's not because I'm ignorant. It's because the information is not readily available from a reliable source yet. So I hope that's interesting stuff that applies not just to this new release, but to all new releases and to the sort of ideal posture that we should adopt as cognizant post-professionals who are trying to do the very best work that we can for our clients. Very good to see all of you guys. I'm excited for all the fun stuff that we have coming up in the next couple weeks and months. And I will see you for our next episode of Grade School and for the next time we get some fresh content out there. Thanks to my buddy Gadali for co-hosting with me. Everybody have an awesome weekend, and I'll see you all very soon.